Now that we've discussed all the functions of the FN Expert software, we're ready to actually begin some training. What we're going to discuss now is some of the screens that you will see once you have a shooter conducting training. Before me, we have the typical trace that you will see once a shooter has taken a shot. And I'll walk you through some of the elements of the trace itself. As you can see, the trace is broken down into separate colors, and each one of these colors corresponds to a time event within that trace. The red portion indicates 0.2 of a second of the trace, and that 0.2 of a second is important because it is the physiological amount of time it takes for a human to make a decision and physically respond to that process. The reason that we use that 0.2 of a second is to represent the trigger squeeze portion in which the shooter makes the decision and physically performs the trigger squeeze action. The yellow segment measures approximately 1 second prior to the 0.2 of a second decision-making time. The white segment covers all time prior to the 1.2 seconds of the yellow and red trace. The next item that you will see on the screen is the blue colored aim box. The aim box provides us with 2 points of information. First, the stability of the shooter. The larger the box is in either direction indicates larger amounts of movement in that particular direction. So for example, in this case, we can see that the box is slightly longer in the up and down direction, meaning that the shooter's stability was a little bit weaker in that position than it was vertically. The next thing the aim box shows us is a small crosshair in the center of the box. That indicates the shooter's point of aim for that particular trace. The next thing that we'll discuss on the training screen is the quick grading system, also known as the traffic lights. The quick grading system measures 3 components of each shot. The first is the steady hold factor, which indicates how stable the shooter was during the course of that particular shot. The next measurement is the point of aim, which indicates how closely to center mass the shooter aimed for that particular shot. And the last is trigger squeeze or trigger control, how well the trigger was manipulated by the shooter during the course of the shot and how much movement was caused during the trigger squeeze phase. All 3 of these items are graded on a green, yellow, red scale, with the optimal performance being green, and these gradings can be modified on the fly to reflect different skill levels. For example, in this particular trace, the aim point was graded red for expert, but yellow for novice, allowing you to tailor the grading experience to the skill level of your shooter. At this point, we will use the software to analyze deficiencies in a series of shots by our shooter. So as we examine this particular trace, we'll see that the shooter aimed relatively close to center mass, and the aim box is relatively small, indicating a stable hold. However, we notice that the point of impact traveled a good distance from the point of aim. We also see a long red line tailing from the point of aim to the point of impact. This indicates a very large amount of movement in a very short amount of time, remembering that a red line only measures 0.2 of a second worth of time. Typically, when we see this sort of trace, it indicates that the shooter jerked his trigger during the execution of the shot, thus moving his point of impact from his point of aim. We also see on the quick grading screen that the shooter received a red in trigger control, thus indicating that it was in fact trigger control that caused the shooter to move his shot from point of aim to point of impact. For the next shot, the screen will display a typical image for a shooter that has movement in the vertical plane. As you can see, as we examine our aim box, the length of the aim box is longer in the vertical direction, indicating more movement in the shooter's position in the vertical plane. Although it is reflected green for a novice shooter, you see as we cycle through more advanced settings, the shooter now is graded a little bit more harshly based on his hold for that particular position. And again, in this shot trace, we can see movement on the horizontal plane, as indicated by a longer aim box in the horizontal direction. The last thing that we're going to examine is a shooter that is changing his sight picture or sight alignment through a series of shots. Perfect. As we look at this trace, we can see a very well executed shot mechanically. And again, another well executed shot mechanically. However, we'll notice that the aim box's position changes in each one of these shots. Normally when you see this, that indicates that the shooter is changing his sight picture or sight alignment through the course of those shots. And this is indicated by the point of aim in the quick grading scale. So in closing, we've discussed some of the functions of the Expert software, and we've examined a few example traces to analyze your shooting performance.